Welcome, Singapore. Welcome, Malaya. Agreed, War Eagle. I think we've had around almost 1,400 people registered. We'll see how many show up. We have about 2 more minutes before we will officially start the Tree Fund webinar. Just waiting for everybody to sign on in.
Do the reminders go out automatically to all those that are registered or not?
Yes, they do. The Zoom system automatically sends a reminder a day before and then 1 hour before. Okay, my clock reads 12 Central here in Alabama, so we will go ahead and start the Tree Fund webinar today. Welcome everybody to the Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I'm the Extension Specialist in Urban Community Forestry here in Alabama, and I would like to welcome you first on behalf of Auburn University. We are always honored to host the Tree Fund webinar series and all the fantastic speakers and researchers that Tree Fund has funded over the years to come in and share their knowledge and the results of their research that Tree Fund has funded. I just want to cover a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to our lead moderator today. This webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available probably sometime tomorrow, maybe Thursday, on the Tree Fund website. If you just go to treefund.org, look at their webinar tab, and there will be webinar recordings. And so if you miss it and want to share it, it'll be downloadable from their webpage. Also, a few housekeeping items. We do have a Q&A box at the bottom. I would encourage you, if you have questions for our speakers, we will hold those for the end of the webinar, and please put those in the Q&A box. Please use the chat box just for catching up with some of the other attendees, maybe making some comments. But if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A box, and Dave and I will do our best, but with now over 700 attendees, it'll be difficult to get to all of them, but we'll get to some of them anyway. We do have CEUs, and I think Dave Krause, our lead moderator, will discuss those. We do submit those on your behalf to ISA. So with that, I would like to introduce our lead moderator, a fellow trustee, Mr. Dave Krause with Asplund. Thank you for being here, Dave.
Thank you. Now if I can get the slide to advance. There we go. Whoops. I'm Dave Krause. As Bo said, I'm the Vice Chair of the Tree Fund Board. chair of the Communications Committee, and also serve as a member of the Governance and Executive Committee. I live in Northeast Pennsylvania, and I work for Asplin Tree Expert Company. And I'd first like to start with a brief review of the Tree Fund. The Tree Fund was established in 2002 with a mission to support scientific discovery and dissemination of new knowledge in the fields of arboriculture and urban forestry. We advance our mission by issuing research grants, providing scholarships to students, and funding K-12 education related to trees and environmental stewardship. Since 2002, the Tree Fund has awarded over $4.4 million for our research and education grants. To see all the research that we've funded through the years, I would encourage you to go to the Research Archives page, as seen on the slide here, of our website, treefund.org. You can search by a keyword or by the scientist's name. We have compiled lists of research projects funded most recently. This year, the Tree Fund presented 10 free webinars on a variety of topics. If you missed any of these, as Bo mentioned, you can review our recordings of these webinars in previous years on our Tree Fund site. We're committed to bring you even more webinars, not only to provide research findings, but also to offer an opportunity for you to earn CEUs. So please donate to the treefund.org by clicking Donate Now to help make these webinars possible. Your support definitely will make a difference. For today, a Tree Fund is offering ISA and SAF CEUs for the live broadcast. The CEU code will not be offered today. Instead, the Tree Fund will submit your name and certification number that you provided during the registration process to the ISA and SAF for CEUs. Only if you did not list your certification number at registration would you need to email Tree Fund to get the CEUs. So that brings me to our speakers, and I'd like to introduce them. Yasha Magarik is an urban forester, an ISA certified arborist with Washington, D.C.'s Urban Forestry Division. He aims to help cities manage their urban forests for long-term benefit, health, and well-being of their people. Before studying and working in urban forestry, he worked for 6 years with the food, farming, and food systems sphere, worked with trees in a variety of contexts and climates, such as orchards, gardens, schoolyards, etc., and started both a small-scale tree nursery and medium-scale food forest. Our other presenter is Lara Roman, PhD. She's a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station at Philadelphia Field Station. She studies the temporal dynamics of urban forests, including tree mortality and growth, canopy cover change, historical development of urban forests, species composition, change, and citizen science monitoring. She has led or co-authored 40 publications, including both academic journal articles and research summaries for professional arboriculture magazines. Her studies take a participatory research approach, collaborating with practitioners for study, design, and implementation. She received a PhD at University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's in biology and master's in environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And now I'd like to turn it over to Yasha and Lara.
Thanks. We're going to have Yasha pull up the slides. For avoidance of any snafus with transitioning between me and him with slides, he'll just do the slides and I'll be saying next now and then. So thank you everyone so much for coming. It was great to see people from all over the US and all over the world in this webinar. Special shout out to other people from here in Philly or people that I knew from when I was in California for a few years. So as was mentioned, I'm a researcher with the Forest Service in Philadelphia. Big thank you to the Tree Fund for funding our research and also giving us this opportunity to present today. We'll go through other acknowledgements and thank yous at the end. Next slide. So here's a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. We're gonna speak about two different but related research projects, and I will bookend the presentation and Yasha will do the meat in the middle. The first project was conducted with our co-author Jason Henning at the USDA Forest Service and the Davey Institute on how best to measure multi-stem urban trees. And that project also brought up some related questions for us that Yasha will touch upon very briefly. Some larger concerns about small stature species that are planted as street trees. And then the second project is an investigation of another research question, which is why we in the United States measure at 4.5 feet anyway. So next slide, thank you. And then again, next, let's dive into the first part of our project. Really to kick this off, a quick review of how and why we measure single stem trees, so ones that are not as complicated as the ones that fork low and are multi-stem. As foresters, the answer of how to measure trees comes to diameter breast height, or DBH. And in the US, the standard default height is 4.5 feet from the ground. DBH is enormously important for a whole range of forestry and arboriculture applications. Here's a list of some of the important uses. They include timber valuation, estimating biomass or carbon storage. DBH is also a proxy for other biometrics, so using DBH to estimate how tall the tree is, how wide its crown is. Also, in terms of the practice of urban forestry, there's spacing and thinning guidelines that are based on how big the tree's trunk is. We also, and very important to my research, use DBH for longitudinal monitoring to understand things like growth of trees over time. And then also DBH can be an important threshold in various ordinances, policies, and contracts. For example, certain cities have strong heritage tree ordinances that say don't remove a tree above a certain size. Next slide. So even though DBH has been enormously important and really quite successful in its application to forestry and arboriculture, both on the research side and the practice side, there are a number of problems. Some researchers have noted there's variation in recorded heights and even sometimes unrecorded heights of measurement. So although 4.5 feet is the standard in the US, other countries that use a metric system tend to use 1.3 meters, but some published studies use other heights entirely, or maybe they don't even report what height they used. And then both researchers and practitioners experience difficulty applying this standard of measuring a trunk at 4.5 feet, or again, in other countries, 1.3 meters, to divergent tree forms, things like acacias, mangroves, and then the topic of our study, multi-stemmed urban trees. So DBH works great for tall, straight species, the kind that are used for timber, but it doesn't work so well for different growth habits. And here, for instance, are photographs from a study on mangroves, and you can just see here how challenging it would be to get one single DBH measurement for these kinds of forests. Next slide. So our research, it was focused on multi-stemmed urban trees and more specifically street trees, although we think that the findings will prove useful for non-urban applications, basically anytime you need to measure a low forking tree. And for the purposes of this study, multi-stemmed is defined as trees that fork between 1 foot and 4.5 feet. Trees that fork below 1 foot are also an issue, but just not the topic of our study. And these trees may be becoming an increasing proportion of certain urban forests as cities replace shade trees under utility lines with small statured, more commonly multi-stemmed species. And we'll get more on that point later. And so as context, in about the past 2 decades, numerous researchers have explored allometry that is specific to cities, noting that urban trees have a unique set of growing conditions and therefore might show different relationships between DBH and other biometrics compared to trees in non-urban settings. And so to make sure I'm clear here, allometry means the relationship between different tree measurements like DBH, total height, crown width, and biomass. So many of you are probably already familiar with iTree, a prominent sampling and software platform made by colleagues of mine in the Forest Service. And it's used by researchers and professionals in measuring and quantifying urban trees, and especially estimating ecosystem services. And so iTree's protocol for these kinds of multi-stem trees, the ones that fork somewhere between 1 foot and 4.5 feet, the protocols are to measure the diameters of up to 6 stems, the largest stems, and they have to be at least 45 degrees from the horizontal. They have to be at least 1 inch in diameter at breast height, again, 4.5 feet, unless there are more than 6 such stems, in which case you actually measure at 1 foot off the ground, or about 30 centimeters. So it's sort of a hybrid approach that blends measuring a bunch of stems at 4.5 feet, or sometimes dropping all the way to 1 foot. And then the DBH that's actually used in ecosystem services estimations is the quadratic sum of those many stem measurements. Okay, so that's a mouthful. But this approach to measuring up to 6 stems at 4.5 feet has long been the standard in other USDA Forest Service guides as well, but it's really cumbersome to apply in the field for practitioners, researchers, and citizen scientists. Next slide. And so our study used a mixed methods approach to evaluate the different ways of measuring multi-stemmed trees. And I had gotten interested in this question of the best way to measure multi-stem trees after doing an evaluation of data quality among citizen scientists. And I heard a lot of complaining about how confusing and time-consuming it was to measure these trees. And I've encountered similar challenges with training and effectively using multi-stem measurement protocols with paid interns. I don't think it's unique to citizen scientists. And actually, when Yasha and I first connected, we were talking about possibilities for his graduate research. He was also dealing with measuring low forking multi-stemmed trees. In his case, it was fruit trees for an agroforestry project. So we turned this issue that was giving both of us headaches, the challenge of measuring multi-stemmed trees, into his graduate research with which the Tree Fund helped to support. And so we conducted the field sampling in the summer of 2017 and conducted the social science and data analysis steps the following fall. And Yasha will describe our methods in more detail and present the results. Turning it over to him.
Thanks so much, Lara. Want to offer a really big thanks to the Tree Fund for supporting our research and offering us this opportunity. And also a big thanks to Lara, who's just the most amazing research advisor and mentor anyone could hope for. So let me talk methods. First, our field sampling was based in Philadelphia at this point it was in summer 2017. I'll be giving an overview of our protocols. I'd be glad to answer any questions about the details, or you can also read the article on urban forestry and urban greening. And that article, just so you know, is available from the USDA Forest Service website under Lara's list of publications. So what we did was we used planting records from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society's tree tenders program from 2003 to 2015. We isolated 3 commonly multi-stemmed genera, which were Malus, Prunus, and Zelkova. That's crab apples, cherries, and Zelkova. And we randomly chose street trees from each of the major cultivars. We thought it would be important to include cultivar analysis, and it did turn out to be useful in our analysis. And then in order to perform more meaningful regression analysis on our data, we also developed an opportunistic sampling protocol to incorporate larger sized specimens from these 3 genera. And here you can see the spatial distribution of the 569 trees we actually measured. The evident geographic clustering, it's fairly representative of the Horticultural Society's actual plantings from that period as a whole. So on each and every tree, we took between 35 and 60 individual measurements. This diagram shows just the main ones. Our primary variables were different methods of measuring diameter, and I'll walk you through the 4 main, or here 5 main ones. And the biometrics like height, total height, and crown diameter. The actual different methods we were evaluating were taking all of the different available stems at breast height at 4.5 feet. I think one tree had as many as 13 of these. We recorded all of those and the heights at which we actually measured those. We wrapped a tape around the entire trees, all of those trunks. That's called the convex closure or convex hull. We took the diameter before the fork swell. We also took diameter at 30 centimeters. This is called D30, or 12 inches of height. And we tried to take the height at the root collar, DRC. So we measured trunk diameter in several different ways. We focused in on just a few of these for the core of our evaluation. We also measured an assortment of site characteristics that might affect the allometry of individual trees. And one thing I want to mention is that this whole data set is available online or by request for others to work with. We posted it as a supplemental material with the published article in the journal. The second component, the second method for us was the social science component, which was a survey of urban forestry practitioners. The survey sought to answer a number of different research questions, including what methods do practitioners currently use, what burdens do these impose, if any, how are urban foresters actually using DBH, which informs how we would recommend dealing with this issue, and then how prevalent are these trees? How big of an issue is this actually? One of the overarching goals of doing such a survey was to consciously bridge the research practitioner divide. To do this survey, we chose a relatively well-defined network of urban ecology practitioners and researchers in 12 cities in the eastern US, which is called the Urban Ecology Collaborative. It's a group of ecologists, urban foresters, arborists, and others working in related fields in the northeastern and mid-Atlantic states of the US. They've been doing webinars and sharing on a monthly basis for many years. For each city, we identified one municipal forester, one NGO-affiliated urban forester, and one city-contracted arborist. We put together a brief online survey on this topic and invited each practitioner to participate by email. We received 25 responses representing all 12 cities in the network. Perhaps some of you on this webinar actually provided those responses, and I want to thank you again. And just to give you a small taste of what this looked like, Bo, we could do that poll now. We actually have a little poll. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds just to feel free to. It's pretty incredible to watch the results come in from 960 people. That's great. That's great. So it looked like about 80% of people on this webinar have actually faced this issue. And then there's a second follow-up poll. There we go. Which is, if you have measured one of these multi-stem trees, what method do you use? We also asked a number of different questions for context on our poll of just those 25 urban forestry practitioners, but these were two of the key questions we were asking. Awesome. And so it looks like the two major ones that are getting used by people on the webinar are to actually measure multiple stems at 4.5 feet, or to measure just below the fork, which is great. Okay. I'm going to talk through the key results from the practitioner survey that we did, which was a little bit more intensive, but not as extensive. So one thing we found is that urban foresters and arborists use DBH for a number of different tasks, particularly inventories, contracts, and estimating ecosystem services. Many respondents confirmed that multi-stem tree measurement imposes significant burdens for them. Practitioners are using a wide range of multi-stem measurement techniques. And finally, more than half of our respondents believe that their city is increasing its proportion of small statured trees. So notable increase in small statured tree plantings, just based on responses. We also asked for access to some of their inventories and planting records. And based on both a little bit of a literature review and looking at some of those inventories and planting records, we think they're right. They are actually increasing the proportion of small statured trees, which tend to be multi-stemmed. This is something that a few researchers have picked up on, but seems to be surprisingly discussed in the literature. Our streetscapes seem to be shifting from large shade trees to shorter ornamental trees. Okay. Those are the results from the survey. Here's where I want to talk about the field data that we actually gathered. Using the field data, we fit regression models for each multi-stem genus, each diameter method, and each predicted biometric to see whether one method showed particularly superior predictive power. For instance, here, for crab apples, we correlated each measurement with average crown width. Since an R² value closer to 1 shows a closer fit, you can compare roughly between methods and see that for this slice of the data, iTree's hybrid protocol seems better than the others, as a higher R² value. But in most cases, iTree's protocol is only marginally better, or in some cases, not better than the other two. To explore just how large those differences are, we also did a whole bunch of bootstrapping for the difference between R² values. Be glad to answer questions about that related process, or you can read about that process in the article. But based on these results, we didn't see a conclusive winner yet. In other words, there's not a big gain in predictive power using DBH to predict crown width or total height from any particular method of measuring DBH for these multi-stem trees. Here's a graph of what that first crabapple set looked like, with all three methods and their regression lines superimposed in different colors and symbols. As you can see, even for a set that showed what might have seemed like a large difference, the degree of clustering or dispersal is not markedly different between methods. Here you can see the distribution of heights at which we're actually able to take each measurement, often because of the trunk bulging associated with the forks themselves. Every method except one was pretty inconsistent. In other words, there was a wide range of where we could actually measure the tree. The one exception to that is D30, that is 30 centimeters or 12 inches off the ground. We were able to take D30 at its intended height on virtually every tree we looked at. In fact, in general, surveying considerations show more marked differences between methods. First, the only method that could consistently be measured at the same height across all multi-stem trees was D30. This means that D30 is probably far easier for field crew training and consistency across field crews and over time. Second, measuring additional stems takes a lot longer, from 1 to over 3 minutes more per tree. Later in grad school, I also tested D30 for a very basic neighborhood census of a little over 2,300 trees in New Haven. In that case, about 14% of trees didn't have a single stem at 4.5 feet. Because we had a really clear system, it took us only 7 seconds more per multi-stem tree to just measure D30, and we could use it on virtually every tree that DBH wasn't doable for. As we already emphasized, adding lots of stems doesn't seem to help much for predictive power. We have a little bit more on that in the article. Comparability between trees and across time became big concerns with both iTree's current method and to some degree diameter below 4. Or most recently, I've thought about this in regard to tree ordinances, which may restrict removal or impose diameter-based fees based on DBH. I'm glad to talk more about that during questions if necessary. Above all, the need for simplification became apparent. So here were our conclusions. One was that diameter at 30 centimeters and diameter below fork has similar predictive power to iTree's current method, but seems superior given other considerations. D30 is particularly promising for researchers for whom having a standard measurement that can be used across the board on this multi-stem tree form seems paramount. But of course, different goals demand different techniques. One of the related research questions that grew out of the measurement study was, why are we planting so many small statured trees and what is the impact on urban tree canopy? This actually developed into a separate project in which I looked at the results of that practitioner survey. I looked at case law and a few case studies of specific neighborhoods. What I've concluded is that a major reason we arborists and urban foresters plant so many small statured street trees is because of overhead utility lines, and that this solution may have a disproportionate impact on dense urban neighborhoods for which street trees constitute a large share of urban tree canopy. I think we really need an independent, comprehensive, by which I mean one that weighs all the costs and benefits on a multi-decadal time scale, cost-benefit analysis of the various solutions to utility tree conflicts. At the very least, we need to acknowledge that what we're doing and make sure our stakeholders understand that. And I think that in cases where urban tree canopy is severely lacking and there has been historical environmental injustice, and that due to housing style, the only space for trees might be along the streets, we need to more seriously consider investing in those communities via other solutions. This might include, for instance, burying power lines so that streetscapes can accommodate larger species of trees. Okay. The second part of what we want to talk about today is something fun, but also a little serious history of science with important implications. What happened was that Lara asked me at one point to look into the history of DBH to figure out why we use 4.5 feet anyway. We thought we'd add 2 sentences to the topic, to the intro of the paper, and before we knew it, we'd gone down a rabbit hole of archives, old texts, and arboricultural and forest history. And here's just a small taste of what that generated. Our main method in this study was to search through hundreds of different historical texts, basically anything we could lay our hands on, with a set of standardized search terms. We also did original archival research at both Yale and Cornell, where 2 of the 3 original forestry schools in the US were located. We downloaded raw anthropometric data from the US Army and used that to fit a series of regressions that I'll mention later. And finally, we read secondary sources on a variety of topics, including the history of the conservation movement, biographical work on the major figures we found, the history and philosophy of metrication and measurement, and so forth. Our literature review included well over 300 sources for this study. Because of time, we'll give just the main snippets. So we arborists and foresters in the US measured DBH at 4.5 feet, which equals 137 centimeters approximately. Europeans measure at 130 centimeters or 1.3 meters. This research asks, why the difference? The first breakthrough in the study was from a class for which I had to read this source. Gifford Pinchot, for those who are not aware, was the founder of Yale Forestry School, the first chief of the USDA Forest Service, and one of the founders of the conservation movement. He was probably the most important US forester ever, even though as a forester, he was, even by his own admission, not the most technically well-trained forester. In 1898, he became chief of the USDA Forestry Division, which later became the USDA Forest Service. The next year, in 1899, he published this manual on forestry, which was reprinted many times. In it, he defines DBH as 4.5 feet and claims that this is, roughly speaking, the general custom. But actually, people were measuring trees at all sorts of heights in the late 19th century. And this is what we delved into in very intense detail. 4.5 feet may have been one height, but it was not the most common, and it definitely was not the standard. One of the major things we looked at was where the Germans were measuring. They used something called a Fuß, which was, of course, the foot, but their foot was defined differently in the 19th century. Scottish and British arborists were using a whole variety of different heights to measure trees in the 19th century. There was someone who actually did an inquiry similar to the one that we did in the past couple of years. He did it in 1879 and looked at all the different literature where people should be measuring trees in the 19th century. 4.5 feet did not make his list, nor did 4.25 feet or 137 centimeters. And the people who were running the British Indian Forest Service in the late 19th century did not seem to use 4.5 feet as a consistent height. In the US, they were also measuring trees at totally different heights. There were arboricultural alternatives. We looked at the ecologists or the proto-ecologists like George Perkins Marsh, Charles Speke Sargent, Emerson, Thoreau. We looked through all of the USDA Forestry Division bulletins that predated Pinchot's announcement, and we looked at all of the work, including the unpublished archival material of Bernard Fernot, who ran the Forestry Division before Pinchot. We did not find a single standard of 4.5 feet. We found a variety of different heights at which people were measuring. Some 4.5, some lots of other things. Okay, we generated 10 different explanations in the process for why we measure at 4.5 feet in the US, or why Pinchot might have thought so. Our historical research convinced us that the first 4 on this list do not explain it, that there was no basis in picking 4.5 feet based on traditions in France, Germany, Britain, or British imperial forests in India. Furthermore, we didn't see any evidence that the people involved thought that there was anything inherently detrimentrically superior about 4.5 feet. In other words, 4.5 feet is not an ideal height based on tapering of the trunk or anything like that. There's a clear need to measure above the root flare, and also not too high so that a person couldn't reach, but basically anywhere in between 1 and maybe 6 feet could have been set as the standard. We also have no evidence that Pinchot was deliberately trying to differentiate US forestry from other countries with a different measurement standard, although he did try to do so in other ways with respect to forest policy and management. And I think there is at least some contribution from a really complicated misconversion of the Bavarian forestry yield tables from the mid-19th century. I'd be glad to discuss later, but I don't want to get too bogged down in that right now. For explanation number 6, which is that it was the most, and we looked at Pinchot's we found his textbook from his forestry days in France. So for explanation number 6, which is that it was the most convenient, average, or natural chest height for US males at the time, what we did was download freely available anthropometric data from the US Army and analyzed it along with other anthropometric data we found online. The data from the US Army includes very precise, rigorous anthropometric measurements on both males and females. US males have gotten 5 centimeters taller since 1900, assuming the essential relationship between chest height and total height has stayed constant. Neither the 1900 average US males nor the current US male's breast height is 4.5 feet. 4.5 feet is still above the 90th percentile for US males and above the 99th percentile for US females. In 1900, breast height for the average US male would have been around 4 feet. Since this is even more of a nice round number than 4.5, we can also reject that explanation. And you can see on this graph where the orange triangles where a average where the matchup of an average US male in 1900 total height with a 4.5-foot breast height would be, and then the purple crosshairs is where it would be today. They're still outside of the norm. There is one other possible explanation, which is both a bit absurd and also quite reasonable. It relies on some knowledge of forest history. Pinchot was abnormally tall. Everybody noticed this. But we weren't satisfied with estimates of his height, which you can find online. We actually found, we went and did archival research at Yale, and we found millimeter accuracy measurements on him from his days at Yale College, where German-trained doctors measured all of the students. This is his anthropometric record. They measured them in astonishing detail at the time. And you can see for 4 years running, they took very exact measurements on him. Then, using that data, we estimated with a linear regression his breast height, and we confirmed this by analyzing 10 different historical photographs. We've just shown 4 of them here. The upshot of all of this is that Pinchot's breast height was very close to 4.5 feet, although this was unusual for US males at the time. We also know from reading his writing and from a number of secondary sources that he was pretty interested in male stature and prowess. Being a tall, fit man was seen as important to being a forester at the time.
So now I'm going to take back over the presentation to talk about the aftermath of Pinchot's decision. So in 1905, Carl Schenck, another early forester who was Pinchot's enemy and rival, there was a lot of fighting going on between these different prominent early foresters in the US. So Schenck published his textbook on forest measurement, and he said that, I quote, "The volume of that part of the bowl which lies below chest height is ascertained as a cylinder as being equal to the cross section chest high times 4.5. And then he has this wonderful little footnote that we think is a little bit passive aggressive. He says 4.3 feet is the chest height usually recognized by the authors. Pinchot adopts 4.5. So it seems to be rejecting the 4.5 foot measurement standard that Pinchot had just recently adopted. But Schenck wasn't the one with all the power in the early days of US forestry. Pinchot was, and so were his different kind of lieutenants and buddies from Yale. And so this choice may have seemed really trivial to us, whether DBH standard was set at 4.5 feet or 4.25 feet or 4.3 feet or some other standard, but it clearly irritated Schenck. And so the men who ultimately wrote the dominant narrative, Pinchot and then Henry Solon Graves, who is Pinchot's second in command, they seemed to set this 4.5 foot standard going forward. So Graves was the first dean of the Yale Forest School, the second chief of the USDA Forest Service. So he wrote in 1906 in his forestry textbook that, quote, "Sometimes specifications of trees bought on the stump call for certain diameters at 6 feet above the ground. This is an awkward point to measure, particularly for a short man. The plan of the forester is to classify all trees by the diameters at breast height is the most practical. This point is above the root swelling, and it is the natural place to caliper a standing tree. In America, 4.5 feet has usually been accepted as the breast height point. In Germany, the breast height is 1.3 meters, or about 4 feet 3 inches. The English have chosen 4.5 feet for their work in England and India, and this has been adopted in this country. It is slightly above true breast height for a short man, but it is just right for a man of average height." So in this whole explanation that Graves wrote, he's actually giving justifications that we've already shown to not be true, including that there was a firm basis for the selection of 4.5 feet in English traditions or in the British Indian Forest Service, or that 4.5 feet is a comfortable average height for men in America. Also, this is a particularly unusual and kind of striking comment from Graves, who was noted by many contemporaries to be a really short man, at least in comparison to Pinchot. Next slide. So there are a few implications of this particular research. First is that, to repeat again, there was no inherent biological or dendrometric basis for the selection of 4.5 feet as the standard in the US. There wasn't a committee of foresters debating what measurement height was best, based either on tree biology or timber estimates, or even typical male height around 1900. The rationale that Graves asserted seems to have been kind of invented after the 4.5 foot decision was already made by Pinchot. And second, the selection of 4.5 feet seems a little more than conveniently to us to be tied to the chest height of one tall and admittedly very, very important man, Gifford Pinchot. And third, and most important for us as people who measure trees for a living, since 4.5 feet really isn't suitable to certain tree forms, and since there's no biological basis for 4.5 feet anyway, we don't have to be beholden to this standard. Now, to be clear, certainly within the US, we should keep measuring at 4.5 feet for trees that have a certain form where it makes sense. The tall, straight trunks, a century of research and management are based on this standard. We are not in any way suggesting to change that. But for different tree forms, like the low forking and multi-stemmed trees that Yasha and I connected over and then examined with the tree data in Philadelphia, we think it's time to consider setting a new standard, something that better aligns with our research and management goals and would work a lot more easily and be easier for training for these trees that aren't your tall, straight growth habits. Next slide. So that concludes our presentation. We have many, many people we'd like to thank. This research was funded in addition to the Tree Fund. It was supported by the Yale Forestry School, the Hickson Center for Urban Ecology. Big thank you to my colleagues at the Forest Service and the Davey Institute, and also, of course, to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society for having fantastic tree planting records that enabled us to do this study to begin with. Anything else, Yasha, you'd like to say before we turn it over to Q&A?
That's great. Thank you so much, Lara.
So it looks like we got a lot of questions in the Q&A. Should we just start plucking them out, or?
Yeah, thank you, Lara. There are a number of questions, and I'm sure you guys have been monitoring. And I can ask them if there's some that jump out to you. Please feel free to. One that kind of jumped out to me was says in your study you only surveyed deciduous trees. Why is that? And did you ever consider evergreens?
I think it was just a matter of practicality. The records that we used, the city we were studying, there aren't as many evergreen street trees, and that's not what our partners at PHS plant. We do think that for the kinds of trees we studied, the cherries and the crab apples and probably other things that have similar growth habit, D30, diameter 30 centimeters, is going to work great. I'd be hesitant to be as confident with other kinds of tree forms. Anything else you want to say on that, Yasha, now that I know you're measuring trees almost every day?
Yeah, just that I think other people asked about like the other type of multi-stemmed that is out there, which is stuff that sprouts from the base, you know, so stuff in the Lathraceae, like crepe myrtles, being a very obvious example. Our study doesn't say anything definitive about that, but it's suggestive of the kind of evaluative criteria that someone would go through to actually figure out what's the best method to use for that. So someone could totally do a similar study with evergreens. We had to use what was available to us, planting data wise.
I did note there was a couple questions related to, you know, the prescriptions for different chemical products that might be used and how they use the, you know, DVH, and there's different methods. How would you connect the work you've done and your methods to, you know, some of these labels that are requiring certain types of measurements?
Ooh. One thing I should say is I'm not a toxicologist, right? So, and we didn't evaluate how you know, a pesticide moves through the xylem of one of these trees, and does it get distributed evenly, and all the sort of questions that, you know, what's the point at which we we hit max impact without without some of the downsides. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Lara?
I just wonder if the companies themselves and whatever research group they have in-house or that they're working with the universities even tried to answer that. I wonder if, you know, if most of the applications that were evaluated were larger trees with a single stem to begin with. So yeah, I'm not sure. It's a great question. I don't have a great answer though.
One thing I did notice as people were asking that question in the Q&A is there are a number of methods in there that are they're non-standard methods. So for instance, taking all of the diameters at 4.5 feet and then dividing by the number of stems that that you actually measured was one that came up, or taking some combination. And we looked at what would it mean to take quadratic sums of different numbers. So that's what I referred to before when I said adding each additional stem doesn't give you that much. One of the things I did was I literally looked at what does it do to the predictive power to add just one stem at dB, just the largest one, then just the 2 largest ones, just the 3 largest ones, all the way down to 13. You know what I mean? And what we ended up seeing was that you just get you get diminishing returns the more time you're spending measuring stems, in terms of how much this is telling you about the size of the crown, basically.
And I guess I would comment that when you look at some of those chemical labels, it's probably a good idea to follow those labels, and you start getting into some different areas there. There's a question here from Mark Ambrose. Says, I have used tree inventory data from multiple sources in my research. A major problem is using such data is that the methods for measuring multi-stem trees is not well documented. Thoughts about encouraging better documentation of inventory data?
Yeah,
Lara,
for sure. So I think in general, it would be great to encourage as the norm, what was the height of measurement used? And I would say that's just as true for single stem, easy to measure trees as it is for multi-stem trees. So that's one thing. The other thing is, for multi-stem trees, if protocol like the iTree protocol was followed, where more than one stem was measured, there should be multiple columns in the database for that and height actually used for each one. Because sometimes, I know exactly what Mark Ambrose is referring to, sometimes it's, well, is this DBH that's in my spreadsheet representative of the crews dropped below the fork and follow that method? Or did they already do the calculations on their own to combine multiple stems into one DBH value? But I think more fundamentally, it's useful to have the actual height that was applied, because while 4.5 feet is the standard, there's a variety of reasons we can't measure that for every single tree. I don't think it actually takes any more time in the field. It's more the norm in kind of longitudinal research projects by academic forest ecologists than it is in arboriculture. And I understand why, it's let's just measure it and move on to the next tree. But when it doesn't add any time, and if there's any interest in using that data for something more than like a contract for removal, I think it's useful to record the actual height used, and to have, for any inventory, some amount of data dictionary or metadata talking about what each field means.
Thank you. There's another question here about any thoughts on the method that adds half the diameter of the smaller stems to the diameter of the largest stem. I'm not exactly sure what Mr. Gunther's referring to there, but maybe y'all do.
I've heard of that. I've not seen it documented in published papers. I've heard other people told me that sometimes is used in different municipal tree inventories, but I haven't seen it documented in research studies. So it wasn't a way of reducing those multiple stem measurements into a single number that we tried. Have you heard people using that, Yasha?
I think maybe at one point, and we might have tried a few different slices with that. I think I think it's a non-standard. In other words, it's not something that researchers and practitioners are both using, and it doesn't come up enough that we considered it strongly. Yeah.
If I could just comment on something I see that's cropped up in the chat, there was a little, are we beating a dead horse? And obviously this is an esoteric question. We fully admit that. But I've had a series of conversations with the folks in FIA, Forest Inventory and Analysis of the Forest Service, and those in charge of UFIA, the new urban FIA program. And when you're running a program like that, or even if you're, with a city, just your one city trying to measure a lot of trees, measuring multiple stems at 4.5 feet, the time adds up and the headaches add up. And so time is money for the field crews, and anything that we can do to reduce the amount of time that crews are standing there scratching their heads, well, where do I measure this one? Does this stem count as a stem I should measure? And all that kind of stuff. It helps with field crew efficiency, it helps with morale. And also back to all the different ways you might use the data, whether it's, giving a permit or not that a tree counts as a heritage tree and needs to be removed, or whether you're trying to estimate biomass, any of those applications across research and practice, to me, consistency is paramount. And the challenge with measuring lots of stems at 4.5 feet is that it's really hard to be consistent even when you are following the rules and the protocols that have been laid out. And so for me, once we started just the initial cut of analyzing Yasha's data and we saw that histogram that he showed with the big spike of almost all the trees at, we call it D30, the diameter at 30 centimeters. They were almost all able to be measured at 30 centimeters. We didn't have to deviate, except in like 2 cases. I went, oh, that's the one I like. Because I like consistency. And it's really hard to measure radial growth of the stem if you don't have consistency. It's really hard to train field crews if you don't have consistency.
And I think you guys brought up a good point that we're seeing more smaller and smaller trees planted than some of the larger species. And so this will probably be a continuing problem. Mm-hmm. I know for here in the South, crepe myrtle it's everywhere. And so this is always a problem when you spend, especially volunteer crews out in the field.
Right. One thing that I have thought about a lot since sort of becoming more of a field arborist is the process of elevation pruning to somewhat avoid this issue. That if we're doing really aggressive, or really active management for a single stem form up to 5 feet, at least, that we somewhat get around this issue. But if you're, even with the most aggressive pruning regimens, I suspect there's still going to be trees that fork between 1 and 4.5 feet on the street.
I see somebody wrote here, is D30 the winner for low forking multi-stem measurement or below the fork? And so as you guys looked at your research, just real quick, kind of in a recap, we're talking, what are y'all seeing as the best measurement spot for these multi-stems?
If you're going to use it in research, Lara, you could, say
yeah, if you're going to use it in research, D30, I think is the clear winner. Because it's consistent. The consistency is, again, paramount. But I do see some benefits to using D below fork. Twofold. One is there's already some adoption from that we documented both in our study, right, and it showed up on our little poll today, that there's some precedents for arborists already using that intuitively. Well, this thing is forking a lot. Let me just drop below it. Be simpler. It also may be practically easier in certain cases, like if there's other stuff around the base of the tree that makes it hard to get there, or some programs that are not having professionals measure the trees or having citizen scientists. If they're elderly, they might have trouble actually literally bending down to get the 1 foot measurement. So probably D30, but we do have to admit this study, while it helped convince us in that direction of D30, it was 500 some trees in one city. So we think this is a first crack at solving this problem, and we would be delighted to see more evaluations like this in additional cities and with additional species and genera of trees.
Thanks, Lara. Is there any other questions? We've got about 2 minutes left. maybe to address one. Is there something else that jumped out at you? We got a lot of questions here, so a lot of interest. Yasha, Lara, anything?
Someone asked about the importance of large trees, and I concur. That's all I can say to that. First, like the large trees, your large, often called shade trees, they provide exponentially more benefits than the small trees. My colleague Jason Henning in our Philadelphia office gives a whole talk about, you know, one big tree is not equivalent to 2 little trees. It's hundreds of little trees in terms of everything from carbon to air quality benefits and everything else. So the small trees are very aesthetically appealing. They meet different site requirements in terms of overhead wires or other kind of site restrictions. But that's why we think, you know, more critical thinking is necessary about fitting in the big trees wherever we can to get their benefits. Anything else you want to say on that, Yasha?
That was great. Yeah.
Did you guys address anything on leaning trees, you know, the measurements? I know the iTree protocols have some recommendations in there. Did you guys look at that at all?
We didn't look at that in our study. Our trees were, or not our trees, but the trees we measured were all in street pits, you know, relatively level. Some were leaning, some were not, but the protocol, as I understand it, is that the tree gets measured from the upslope side, and is the tape should be wrapped perpendicular to the bowl, not perpendicular to the ground. If that makes any sense.
It does. Well, with that, we have just a minute. I want to thank both of you for a fantastic presentation. I think very useful work, and I really appreciate it. I think the historical perspective with Pinchot and looking at where 4.5 came from. I'm a history buff, and I just found that was fascinating. And so I love little snippets like that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being on the Tree Fund webinar series. It's always good to get some different perspectives, different topics. I will share the Q&A poll with both of you, as well as some of those poll results. And so thank you, Dave, for doing the Tree Fund introduction at the beginning of the webinar today. And thanks, Monica, as always, for really being the person that advertises, helps put these webinars together, helps select these topics. She does just a wonderful job with this. And so with that, just a quick reminder, we will be submitting those CEUs on your behalf. You will not see the CEU code, and give ISA asks about 4 to 6 weeks. And there's lots of webinars, so I think they are getting a lot of volume of stuff coming in. Dave, any closing comments? Nope. Okay,
Nope.
well,
Thank you so much.
yeah, fantastic talk, you guys. It was good to see that, and hope to have you back sometime in the future. With that, I'll go ahead and conclude the Tree Fund webinar series today, and hope to see everybody back. We're working hard on some future topics for later this year and for 2021. So keep checking the Tree Fund website. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.